Hi, welcome back to Risk Management. Today's topic is Risk Screening Part 4. This is a topic today where we're going to consider a hodgepodge of different things. First, talking about the so-called cascade effect, where we look at what the implications of screening are step by step, because it's not a costless decision. If one decides to screen, there are follow-up steps that have to be taken, and those follow-up steps are not always nice, and they don't always result in good things. Second, we're going to ask the question, well, if we have to go through those follow-up steps, is it possible just to rescreen and resample over and over so that we can make sure we got the test results right before we do any follow-up steps? We'll see the problems with that kind of logic. And third, we'll start today, but not finish, discussions of risk profiling. Some of you have obviously heard the word profiling in many different subject areas. We're going to ask the question provocatively, and not finish it today, but in the next lecture, is profiling always bad? Or, looking at this from a risk monitoring standpoint, is there sometimes a justification to profile individuals or groups of people? We'll look at that starting today, but continuing in the next class. But first, back to the idea of a cascade effect, why monitoring can actually kill. At some point in the monitoring process, potentially harmful action begins to occur, either as a result of the inaccurate monitoring or to achieve more accurate monitoring. Remember in the last class we talked about liver cancer screening, where we started with a blood test, and then we followed up with another blood test, and then we followed up with an invasive liver biopsy. Now, first of all, when we do a blood test and we get false results, those in themselves have implications. If we screen and somebody gets a false negative back, they're going to walk away feeling comforted when in fact they have a disease that could have been cured earlier. And in fact, they may delay and put off coming in when they actually get symptoms of that disease because they say, well, surely I didn't have a disease, I screened negative for it. Another problem is when we have false positives. That is, when individuals are told they have the illness, but they actually don't. The problem with that is first psychological harm, and second that it never just stops there. Once you know that, or at least are told, that you have a condition, there's going to be future interventions and steps taken to try to deal with it. And those steps are not always nice, innocuous, or safe. They themselves may carry risks and may put you at unnecessary risk when you have a false positive. One of the comments that's often likened, or analogies that's often likened to the cascade effect, or this so-called waterfall of effects that will occur once someone starts monitoring, is Brer Rabbit and the tar pit baby. The first step appears to be a benign action, it's said, such as ordering a diagnostic test. However, the discovery of an unexpectedly abnormal result leads to progressively riskier and costlier interventions that sometimes seem unnecessary and unavoidable. This situation is like the story of Brer Rabbit and the tar baby. Brer Rabbit greets the tar baby and takes its failure to communicate as snobbery. He hits the tar baby to teach it a lesson and it gets stuck. In an effort to make the tar baby let go, he hits it with the other hand, then kicks it. With each blow, Brer Rabbit becomes more ensnared rather than closer to a solution. And that is the problem with monitoring without careful consideration in advance of its prudence. If we simply start monitoring, there's going to be follow-up consequences. And the more consequences there are, the more we become enmeshed in the results of our monitoring unnecessarily. Now, I want to give an example of this cascade effect, and this comes from a very recent phenomenon, fetal heart monitoring. This is where when a woman is pregnant and considered to need this sort of intervention, fetal heart monitoring is done, where an oscilloscope is put on the woman's chest and listened to through the uterus to determine the baby's heart rate. And the thinking is that if the heart rate slows, this monitoring will detect it early and help the doctors to intervene before some sort of cataclysmic event occurs and the fetus is lost. Now, to achieve such an accurate reading, the mother, in order to be able to be fetal heart monitored, has to remain relatively inactive in bed. That's just a necessity of the actual screening process. But the fact that she lies still in bed involuntarily forces her to slow down her labor. She's not moving actively as women typically do during labor. She has to sit still. The concerned and observant physician will note that her labor has slowed down, and they will often intervene to speed up the labor as a result of that. For example, they may rupture her membranes to speed up the labor. This acceleration of labor in turn causes increased pressure on the baby's skull, which causes abnormal fetal heart rate monitoring. So you see the cascade going on here. The physician-induced labor acceleration simultaneously increases the pain of contractions for the mother and may prompt her to request anesthesia. She's in pain now, and so then she asks for anesthesia. Well, we have to grant her anesthesia when she's in that much pain. If the doctor chooses to give her that anesthesia, her blood pressure may go down, and that may cause even more abnormal readings on the fetal heart monitor. The cascade effect is thought to explain why cesarean sections, C-sections, are about 40% higher when electronic monitoring of fetuses are used rather than simply feeling the mother's belly to see how the baby is doing. So in monitoring with a fetal heart monitor, it's not a costless decision. In fact, it's thought to lead to C-sections unnecessarily about 40% more often than not. And C-sections themselves carry higher risks of mortality for the mother and obviously more complications in the healing process than if she had not had that. So here's an example of that cascade effect. A simple thought that we would monitor to make sure the baby's heart is doing okay in advance of delivery may in fact lead to complications in delivery itself. Another way that this is said in a more simple way by an old eponymous saying is for want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For want of the shoe, the horse was lost. For want of the horse, the rider was lost. For want of the rider, the battle was lost. For want of the battle, the kingdom was lost. And all for the want of a horseshoe nail. So this shows that cascade and how a simple desire to monitor at a simple, innocuous level what might not seem objectionable can lead to very cataclysmic results, even if the monitoring supposedly works. One way people say that it might get around these problems with monitoring is, well, let's just screen a whole bunch of times over and over and over. And if we screen over and over, we'll get accurate results. The problem with that is the monitoring strategy can come in two forms. One is to rescreen people over and over where we replace people. That is, that when people actually test negative, we put them back in the screening population, or where they test positive, we test them again. So we screen the same population over and over and over a whole bunch of times, and we try to see, do people come out positive at all or not? The problem with this, and here's a series of examples where I have different study size populations, 100 people in the population, or 300, or 500, 700,000, or 2,500. Let's assume the specificity of our test is 95%, a very accurate test. In this chart, I give you the number of false positives that are going to result if we test once, 5 times, 10 times, or 15 times. And notice that the number of false positive grows depending on how many times we've tested the population. That is, if we test the population once with 100 people in it, the top upper left little quadrant cell, we get 5 false positives. But if we test 5 times, we'll get 23 false positives. If we test 10 times, we'll get 40 false positives. That is, people who have tested as positive at least once falsely out of the population. If we test 15 times, 54 out of the 100 people will test falsely positive at least once. You can see this results all the way down for 2,500 people, where exactly the same scenario, about half the population will test positive falsely if we screen them at least 15 times. So testing over and over is not improving our PPV. It's not improving the diagnostic quality of our study. All it's doing is increasing the false positive rate. So rescreening with replacement is not a good strategy for trying to improve the overall accuracy and PPV of our monitoring. Well, you say, okay, let's not rescreen people. If they screen negative, we won't rescreen them again. We'll only screen the false positives again. The problem with that are twofold. Number one, different tests for the same condition usually have correlated error. That is, false positives tend to stay false positives even if you use a different test the second time around. False negatives tend to stay false negatives, even if they use different tests a different time around. So simply because you say we're going to use a different test the second time, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to improve your overall PPV rate. The second problem with this is that every round of retesting means you're going to screen out more false negatives. If somebody tests positive the first time around, and then they test negative the second time around, you'd say, well, they tested negative. Let's get them out of the population. That is, we're not going to use replacement. But then you're going to miss some false negatives, people who were truly diseased or had the condition, but who you've screened out of your subpopulation. And that's the problem with false screening results, where you've retested and rescreened recurrently without replacement. It's not a good testing strategy either. The U.S. Public Health Service, when talking about monitoring its Superfund sites, where they screen people, for example, for cancers after they've been exposed to toxic chemicals, says the following about effective testing. There should be an accepted screening test that meets the requirements for validity, reliability, estimates of yield, meaning what the PPV will be, sensitivity, specificity, and cost of the study. So the U.S. Public Health Service recognizes that prevalence of the condition, sensitivity and specificity, that is the accuracy, and the actual cost of administering the test are all important factors to consider, just as we've been saying throughout this set of series on risk screening. The other thing that they emphasize, though, is that the disease prevalence itself is a critical factor, as we've also been saying throughout this lecture series, in order to determine effective testing techniques. The population being screened, they say, should be at sufficiently high risk for the undiagnosed disease. That is, there should be a sufficiently high prevalence in the population before one decides to screen. This is not always the case, and this is where things get controversial. Larry Lessig, a law professor at Harvard, talks about what he calls insanely destructive devices, IDDs, or an insanely destructive world. He says that sometimes certain things are so scary and can cause so much harm that even where the prevalence is low, even where we're going to get lots of false positives and falsely accuse people and falsely lead down all sorts of bad cascade effects, we still should screen. And the example he gives is suitcase nuclear weapons. If we're screening for such things, one of those nuclear weapons that goes off that destroys half of the United States obviously is something that he says we should screen for no matter the cost, because the cost to other people of being accused of being terrorists falsely, of screening for things and letting things be considered false positives is warranted in light of the fact that if just one of these goes off, it could cause cataclysmic, apocalyptic harm. So that's something to keep in mind, is that when we create our decision tree table, as we did before, we always have to ask ourselves, what kind of harms is it that we're dealing with? Cataclysmic, minor, or somewhere in between? And there's no perfect science to judging this in terms of whether we should or should not monitor. We need to take into account the number of false positives and false negatives, but we also need to take into account what sort of things are going to happen if true positives come true. Is it a cataclysmic, apocalyptic event, or is it something more livable? Finally, and I want to just motivate this a little bit today, and it will be the topic in our final concluding lecture on screening, is the issue of screening subpopulations, that is, of profiling. One of the tactics that we could use to try to increase the prevalence of the condition that we're screening for is to only screen subsets of the population where we know that prevalence is high. If we monitor only that subpopulation, and that subpopulation has easily verifiable traits that predict that a person in that subpopulation has a much higher chance of having the condition than the general background population, maybe it's worthwhile to screen a subpopulation rather than a general screening process. Let me give you a few examples so that this makes sense. For example, number one, we don't monitor women for prostate cancer. That's because women don't have prostates. But prostate screening among men conceivably could make more sense, because men do get prostate cancer and their prevalence is not zero, whereas among women the prevalence of prostate cancer is zero, so it would make no sense to do a general screening of prostates, whereas it might make sense to screen among men. Another example, annual mammograms are recommended for women over age 40, but not for men, and not for younger women. That's true even though men can get breast cancer and women under 40 can get breast cancer, they get it less frequently. The prevalence for men and younger women getting breast cancer is much lower than for women over age 40. So maybe it makes sense to have annual mammograms for older women, but not for men and for younger women. We are, in other words, going to screen a subclass of individuals and not engage in general screening. Another example, thyroid cancer monitoring in children living within 100 miles of the Chernobyl nuclear plant that blew up in the 1980s. Children there were observed to have 1,000 times higher prevalence of thyroid cancer than the background rate of thyroid cancer in general populations around the world. So it might make sense to screen children for thyroid cancer who live near Chernobyl, but it doesn't make sense to screen because the prevalence is so low in general background populations worldwide for thyroid cancer. Now notice something. I've described subpopulations where we've screened for certain conditions and said it makes sense to screen in the subpopulation, but not in the general population. This is another way of saying we should profile. And some of you may have been nodding along with the 3 examples I just gave and said, yes, in these 3 circumstances, I understand why you would monitor one population and not the general population. But a definition of those could be that we are in fact profiling. For example, if we only screen for men in prostate cancer and not women, aren't we gender profiling? Or if we only screen women over age 40 for breast cancer but not men and not younger women, aren't we both gender and age profiling when it comes to mammograms and breast cancer? Or, for example, if we're only going to screen around the nuclear plant at Chernobyl for thyroid cancer and only in children, aren't we doing geographic profiling and age profiling? Is profiling always wrong, or are there circumstances where it might be warranted in order to deal with and detect latent conditions that otherwise could come to fruition and cause harm? This will be the source of discussion in our final lecture in this series. I look forward to hearing your discussion and thoughts on the chat boards, and I'll see you in the next class.